Fear does not arrive all at once. It seeps into a city quietly, invisibly, until suddenly it is everywhere. At first it was only a rumor, whispers exchanged in marketplaces, anxious conversations at doorsteps, uneasy glances between neighbors. A strange sickness had appeared in a distant region. People spoke of a fever that consumed the body in days, of coughing that would not stop, of weakness so severe that even the strongest collapsed without warning. Most believed it would never reach them. But it always did. Within weeks, the rumors became reality. The illness moved faster than anyone expected. Traveling through trade routes, crowded streets, and tightly packed homes, one by one, cities were overtaken, and with it came something even more powerful than disease: fear. Church bells rang constantly, not to call people to worship, but to announce another death. Graves filled faster than they could be dug. The sick overflowed from hospitals into homes, streets, and abandoned buildings. Entire neighborhoods fell silent, not because they were empty, but because everyone was hiding. This was not simply a medical crisis, it was a collapse of social order. People believed the plague was a curse. Others believed it was divine punishment. Some whispered that it marked the end of the world. Medicine offered little help, and explanations brought no comfort. When certainty vanished, fear took control. Doctors fled cities they could no longer protect. Wealthy families escaped to the countryside. Government officials abandoned their posts. Even religious leaders, those expected to bring hope, quietly disappeared. Survival became the highest moral value. Parents avoided their own children. Friends refused to open their doors. The sick were left alone, not because they were unloved, but because loving them now carried a deadly cost, and in many ways fear made sense. No one knew how the disease spread. Touch could kill. Proximity could infect. Compassion itself became dangerous. To stay close to others was to risk everything, so people ran. But in the middle of this chaos, one Christian made a decision that defied every instinct of self-preservation. While others fled, he stayed, not because he believed he was immune, not because he underestimated the danger, not because he was fearless. He stayed because his faith would not allow him to abandon those who were suffering. This is the true story of a Christian whose faith saved thousands during one of the deadliest plagues in history. To understand the weight of that decision, we must understand what staying truly meant. Remaining in the city meant daily exposure to death. It meant breathing infected air, entering contaminated homes and touching bodies others were too afraid to approach. It meant watching people die slowly, often painfully, with no cure and little hope. Staying meant almost certain risk. And yet, this Christian did not view the question as one of personal safety alone. He believed something far more dangerous, that faith was not meant to be practiced only when it was convenient. For him, faith was not an idea, it was a responsibility. The plague did more than kill bodies, it tested convictions. People who had spoken easily about love, mercy, and compassion now faced a terrifying question. Did those values still apply when practicing them could cost your life? For many, the answer was no, but for him, the answer was clear. He believed that Christ's command to love one's neighbor did not come with exceptions, not during war, not during famine, not during plague. So when panic overtook the city, he did the unthinkable. He organized aid. He arranged food deliveries for families trapped in quarantine. He created systems to care for the sick when hospitals collapsed. He encouraged believers to remain, not recklessly, but faithfully, serving where they could, protecting the vulnerable, and refusing to abandon the dying. And when others refused to enter infected homes, he went himself. He prayed with the sick. He held the hands of those taking their final breaths. He comforted families who had lost everything. He offered presence when presence was the most dangerous gift of all. This was not dramatic heroism. It was quiet, exhausting, and relentless. Day after day, Death surrounded him. He buried friends. He watched children die. He witnessed suffering so intense it broke even the strongest hearts. And still, he stayed. Why? Because he believed something that contradicted the fear of his time. He believed that while death could not always be avoided, abandonment could. He believed that if people were destined to die, they should not die alone. That if society was collapsing, someone had to stand in the ruins and refuse to let compassion disappear. This belief transformed him into a leader. Others, inspired by his courage, began to follow. Small groups formed, care networks emerged, volunteers risked their lives to bring food, medicine, and comfort to the forgotten. Slowly, something extraordinary happened. Fear loosened its grip, not because the plague ended, not because the danger vanished, but because love returned. Historians later estimated that the movement he helped lead saved thousands of lives, not by curing the disease, but by preventing starvation, despair, and isolation from claiming even more victims. People survived because someone stayed. Yet today his story is rarely told. His courage is buried beneath statistics, his faith reduced to footnotes, his actions overshadowed by timelines and death counts. But his decision to remain when escape was possible continues to echo across centuries, because this story is not only about a plague. It is about what happens when belief stops being theoretical and becomes costly. It is about the moment faith collides with fear and refuses to retreat. In times of safety, faith is easy. In times of comfort, belief is convenient. But in moments of crisis, when fear dominates and survival feels uncertain, faith reveals its true depth. This Christian understood that. He understood that loving others was not suspended during emergencies, that compassion did not require ideal conditions, that obedience did not wait for safety, and because of that understanding, thousands lived. In the next part of this story, we will step deeper into the life of this man, his background, his theology, and the internal struggle that led him to choose service over self-preservation. We will explore what shaped his faith long before the plague arrived, and why his decision was not spontaneous, but rooted in deeply held convictions. But before we continue, pause for a moment. If this story has already captured your attention, if it challenges how you think about faith, courage, and sacrifice, take a second to support this channel, like this video, subscribe to hear more true Christian stories from history, and comment below, what would you have done in his place? Your engagement helps ensure these forgotten voices are heard again. When you're ready, we'll continue. Long before the plague arrived, before fear silenced the streets and death filled the air, this Christian was already being shaped by questions most people avoided. He was not born into crisis, he was formed for it. From an early age, he showed an unusual seriousness about faith. While others treated belief as tradition or habit, he wrestled with it as something alive, demanding and deeply personal. Scripture was not merely read, it was studied, questioned, and internalized. He believed faith was meant to shape action, not simply comfort the soul. This belief guided his education. He immersed himself in theology, history, and philosophy, seeking not only knowledge, but understanding. He wanted to know how faith had guided believers through suffering before, through persecution, famine, war, and collapse. He did not ignore human reason. He respected learning, logic, and structure, but he refused to separate intellect from obedience. For him, faith and action were inseparable. As he grew into leadership, this conviction became visible. He spoke often about responsibility, not as a burden, but as a calling. He believed that privilege demanded service and that spiritual authority was meaningless without sacrifice. Even before the plague, he was known for standing with the vulnerable. He visited the poor, he advocated for the forgotten, he challenged complacency within the church. While others debated doctrine from a distance, he insisted that belief had to be lived out in the real world, among suffering people, in uncomfortable places. This perspective was not universally welcomed. Some admired his conviction. Others found it unsettling. He challenged a comfortable faith, one that remained untouched by risk. He warned that a belief unwilling to act in times of danger was already hollow. Many listened politely. Few expected those words would soon be tested so severely. When news of the plague first reached the city, it was treated as distant tragedy, a terrible event, but not their problem. Life continued. Services were held. Trade persisted. But he paid attention. He read accounts from other cities. He studied patterns of spread. He listened to travelers and merchants who carried grim stories from regions already devastated. He understood what was coming before most were willing to admit it. And as fear began to rise, so did debate within the Christian community. Some argued that fleeing was an act of wisdom. Others believed staying was tempting fate. Many searched Scripture for justification, either to leave or to remain. He did not rush to judgment. Instead, he asked a different question, not what is safest, but what is faithful. This question haunted him. He knew that faith did not require recklessness. He understood that life was a gift, not something to be discarded carelessly. But he also knew that fear had a way of disguising itself as wisdom. He believed discernment required courage. As the plague entered the city, the tension became unbearable. People packed their belongings overnight, streets filled with carts and wagons. Families split apart as some fled and others were left behind. The church itself fractured. Some leaders urged evacuation, others remained silent. A few insisted that God would protect those who stayed, while doing nothing to care for the sick. He rejected extremes. He did not promise divine immunity. He did not condemn those who left. But he refused to abandon those who could not escape, the poor, the sick, the elderly, and the forgotten. For him, the choice was no longer theoretical. Staying meant exposure, leaving meant safety. But leaving also meant silence, turning away from cries he could no longer hear. And so, after prayer, reflection, and counsel, he made his decision. He would stay, not alone, but with purpose. He began organizing immediately. Knowing the plague would overwhelm existing systems, he worked to build new ones. He coordinated care teams. He mobilized believers who felt the same burden. He encouraged caution, cleanliness, and responsibility, but also presence. He believed fear should not dictate morality. As the death toll rose, his leadership became essential. When authorities collapsed, his structure remained. When hospitals closed, his networks functioned. When despair threatened to consume the city, his calm steadiness became an anchor. People trusted him, not because he claimed power, but because he showed up. Every day he walked through streets others avoided. Every day he faced grief that would have broken most people. And every night he prayed, not for escape but for endurance. This was not blind courage, he was afraid. He watched friends fall ill. He felt the weight of responsibility crushing his spirit. He wrestled with doubt, exhaustion, and the constant awareness that he might not survive. Faith did not remove fear. It gave him a reason to move through it. And something remarkable happened. His presence changed the moral atmosphere of the city. People began to see that fear did not have the final word, that compassion could exist alongside danger, that life still held meaning even in the shadow of death. Even those outside the Christian community noticed. They watched believers risk their lives for strangers. They saw care offered without expectation of reward. They witnessed love expressed not in words, but in costly action. Many later recorded that this faith-driven compassion stood in stark contrast to the abandonment they experienced elsewhere. The plague exposed the foundations of society. Some collapsed under pressure. Others revealed unexpected strength. This Christian's faith was not invented during the crisis. It was revealed by it. His theology, shaped long before the plague, now guided every decision. He believed that Christ had entered human suffering, not avoided it. That true love moved toward pain, not away from it. This belief carried him forward day after day, but it came at a cost. The strain weakened his body. The constant exposure eroded his health. He lived knowing that infection was not a possibility, but a probability. And still, he did not retreat. Because for him, faith was never about preserving life at all costs. It was about preserving meaning. In the next part of this story, we will walk into the darkest days of the plague. When death reached its peak, hope nearly vanished, and the consequences of his decision became painfully real. We will see how close he came to losing everything, and how faith was tested not just by fear, but by suffering itself. The plague did not slow down. It intensified. What had once been fear turned into routine. What had once been whispered rumors became names, familiar names, spoken softly, then never spoken again. Entire households disappeared within days. The city no longer measured time by weeks or months, but by loss. Each morning brought new deaths. Each evening ended with exhaustion so deep it felt physical. Bells rang endlessly, not to mark time, but to announce absence. For the Christian who chose to stay, this was the season when faith stopped being a conviction and became endurance. The systems he helped build were now stretched to their breaking point. Care networks were overwhelmed. Supplies vanished quickly. Volunteers collapsed under fatigue or fell ill themselves. The sick multiplied faster than help could reach them. Every decision carried weight. Who would receive care today? Who would be reached too late? Which home would be silent by nightfall? He carried these questions with him constantly. Each day began with uncertainty. He never knew which streets would be blocked, which homes would still contain life, which friends would still be breathing. He walked knowing that every door he opened could expose him to infection, and every door he ignored could mean abandonment. Death was no longer an idea. It was a presence that followed him. He entered homes where entire families lay dying. He encountered children sitting beside lifeless parents, unsure what to do next. He prayed over bodies still warm, knowing burial would come before sunrise. There were moments when despair pressed in with unbearable force. He questioned whether his efforts mattered, whether staying truly made a difference, whether the suffering was simply too vast to confront. But reality answered those doubts relentlessly. A mother survived because someone brought food when she was too weak to stand. A child lived because someone refused to leave them alone. A family endured because presence replaced abandonment. In a world collapsing under fear, presence became an act of resistance. The plague stripped society to its core. It revealed how fragile systems truly were and how quickly fear could erase compassion. Many who once spoke confidently about morality now chose distance and silence. But something else was happening alongside the collapse. Courage was spreading. Inspired by his example, others stepped forward. Not because they felt brave, but because they felt compelled. They organized small teams, they rotated care, they risked their lives not out of recklessness, but out of responsibility. Faith was no longer preached, it was practiced, and it was costly. As days turned into weeks, his body began to weaken. Sleep became fragmented. Fatigue settled into his bones. His immune system eroded under constant exposure. Fevers came and went. His lungs burned. Each cough raised the same terrifying question. Had he been infected? He knew the signs. He had watched the progression countless times. He knew that recovery was uncertain and death was common. Still, he did not withdraw. This was not because he believed himself indispensable. It was because he believed fear gained power when leaders disappeared. If he retreated, others would follow. So he remained visible. He continued walking the streets. He continued entering homes. He continued standing where others could see that compassion had not vanished. There were nights when he collapsed from exhaustion, unsure if he would wake again. Nights when he wrote letters to loved ones, aware they might be his last words. Nights when fear whispered that survival would be easier if he simply left, but every morning brought the same decision: stay or retreat. Every morning he stayed. Observers outside the Christian community noticed. They saw believers caring for the sick when others refused. They witnessed funerals attended by those who should have fled. They noticed something unsettling, that faith produced resilience where fear produced collapse. Some began to ask questions. Why would anyone risk their life for strangers? Why stay when escape was possible? Why choose service over survival? The answer was not strategy, it was conviction. This Christian believed that life found its meaning not in preservation, but in purpose. As the plague reached its peak, the death toll was staggering. Entire districts were nearly emptied, commerce vanished, schools closed, families disintegrated. The air itself seemed heavy with grief. Hope felt fragile. And yet, amid the devastation, signs of endurance appeared. The rate of new infections began to slow, not suddenly, but perceptibly. Survivors emerged cautiously from isolation. Communities attempted to rebuild basic order. The city, though deeply scarred, began to breathe again. The plague did not disappear overnight, but it loosened its grip. When the worst finally passed, the city stood transformed. Not spared, not untouched, but changed. The Christian who stayed did not celebrate survival. He mourned losses. He buried friends. He carried physical weakness and emotional scars that would never fully fade. But he had no regrets. Thousands had lived because someone stayed when others fled. Years later, historians would look back and recognize that this period marked a turning point, not only medically or socially, but morally. The plague revealed something enduring. It revealed that faith, when lived authentically, could hold communities together when fear threatened to tear them apart. This Christian never claimed credit. He resisted praise. He insisted that what he did was not extraordinary, only faithful. But history remembered differently. His actions became a reference point. His leadership became a model. His courage became evidence that belief could produce tangible good in moments of unimaginable crisis. And yet, his story faded into obscurity, overshadowed by statistics, buried beneath timelines, reduced to footnotes focused more on death than on courage. But his legacy endured, because the question he faced remains unanswered in every generation. What do we owe one another when fear takes control? In the next part of this story, we will examine the long-term impact of his actions, how this moment reshaped Christian thought, responsibility, and action in times of disaster. And we will explore why his legacy still matters today, not as distant history, but as a challenge to the present. When the plague finally loosened its grip, the city did not celebrate. There were no public gatherings, no songs of relief, no sense of triumph. What remained was silence, heavy, unfamiliar, and filled with absence. Entire streets stood half empty. Homes once filled with voices now echoed with memory. Shops were abandoned. Churches were quieter. Families counted who was missing before they counted who remained. Survival did not feel like victory. It felt like responsibility. For the Christian who had stayed, the end of the plague marked the beginning of a different burden. During the crisis, every moment had been driven by urgency. There was no time to reflect, only to act. Now there was time. Time to remember faces. Time to mourn friends. Time to feel exhaustion settle deep into his body and spirit. The adrenaline faded, and what remained was the weight of everything that had been endured. He did not measure the plague by numbers. He measured it by names. People he had prayed with, people he had buried, people whose lives had ended while he held their hands. And yet, amid the grief, Something undeniable had emerged. The city was still standing, not intact, not whole, but standing. And the reason was not strength, wealth, or preparation. It was presence. During the darkest days, when fear drove many away, faith had driven some to stay. When institutions collapsed, communities formed. When self-preservation became instinct, sacrificial love became resistance. The plague had exposed the fragility of society, but it had also revealed its foundations. People began to talk, not immediately and not loudly. At first, the stories spread quietly, shared in homes and small gatherings. Stories of Christians who had entered infected houses without hesitation, of food delivered to families sealed inside their homes, of prayers spoken when doctors refused to come. Even those who did not share the faith noticed something unsettling and profound. Believers had not been immune to fear, they had simply refused to let fear decide. This realization changed how the city understood Christianity. Faith was no longer seen merely as a personal comfort or private conviction. It had proven itself as a force capable of holding communities together when everything else failed. The Christian who stayed did not claim credit for this shift. He resisted being called a hero. When praised, he redirected attention toward the countless unnamed believers who had served faithfully beside him. But leadership leaves a trace, even when it avoids recognition. Church leaders across the region began to rethink their priorities. Sermons changed, teaching shifted. The question was no longer only about belief, it was about responsibility. What does faith require when safety disappears? What does obedience look like when it becomes costly? What does love demand when survival is uncertain? The answers were no longer theoretical. They had been lived in real time. In the years following the plague, Christian communities reorganized themselves. Care for the sick became central, not optional. Service to the vulnerable was treated as a defining mark of faith, not a secondary calling. The example set during the plague became a reference point, a moment that redefined what it meant to follow Christ in a broken world. The Christian at the center of this story continued to lead, but differently. His words carried the weight of experience. His teachings were shaped by loss, endurance, and hope refined by suffering. He spoke often about presence, about staying when leaving would be easier, about loving when retreat would feel reasonable, about faith that does not disappear when circumstances become dangerous. His message was not dramatic. It was grounded. Faith, he believed, was never meant to be tested only in comfort. It was meant to endure pressure, to remain steady when fear was loud, to serve when reward was uncertain. His influence extended far beyond his lifetime. Future generations of Christians looked back to this moment when preparing for crises of their own. Epidemics, wars, social collapse. Each time, the same story resurfaced, not as legend, but as instruction. Even historians outside the Christian faith took notice. Records showed that communities marked by organized Christian care recovered more quickly. Social bonds remained stronger. Trust, though damaged, was not destroyed. The presence of faith had changed outcomes. And yet, as time passed, the man himself slowly faded from public memory. His name did not dominate textbooks. His story was condensed into brief historical mentions. The world preferred timelines and statistics over personal sacrifice. But legacy does not require fame. It requires impact, and his impact endured quietly, carried forward in actions inspired by his example rather than admiration for his name. He had demonstrated something timeless, that faith is not fragile, that belief can endure pressure without breaking, that love can exist even when death feels overwhelming. Most importantly, he proved that fear does not have the final word. As new generations faced their own uncertainties, his life continued to ask a question that history never stops asking. When danger returns, what will remain? Comfort or courage? self-preservation or responsibility, silence or presence. His story was not preserved to inspire nostalgia. It was preserved to offer preparation. Because crises will come again, fear will rise again, and when it does, the measure of faith will not be found in words spoken from safety, but in actions taken when staying costs everything. In the final part of this story, we will step back and reflect on why stories like this still matter today, why remembering them is not about the past, but about readiness for the future, and why the legacy of one Christian who stayed continues to challenge every generation that follows. History often feels distant. Plagues, wars, and suffering are usually confined to books, documentaries, and timelines. They feel like events governed by different rules, lived by people unlike us. It is comforting to believe that, placed in those moments, we would have acted with clarity, courage, and wisdom. But history does not exist to comfort us. It exists to confront us. The story of this Christian who chose to stay during the plague endures not because it is dramatic, but because it is revealing. It exposes what remains when fear strips everything else away, titles disappear, institutions collapse, certainty dissolves. What remains is choice. The man at the center of this story did not possess extraordinary courage. He felt fear deeply. He understood the risks. He knew that staying could cost him his life. What set him apart was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make the final decision. When the plague arrived, he faced the same question everyone faced: stay or leave. He chose to stay, not because survival was meaningless, not because life was expendable, but because he believed life found its deepest meaning when given in service to others. That belief did not remove danger. It did not guarantee safety. It did not spare him grief, exhaustion, or loss. What it did was anchor him. It gave him clarity when panic clouded judgment. It gave him purpose when chaos erased structure. It gave him direction when the world became unrecognizable. And through that clarity, lives were saved. Not through miracles, not through immunity, but through presence, organization, compassion, and endurance. Thousands lived because someone refused to abandon them. This story forces us to face uncomfortable questions. What do we value most when fear takes control? What do we protect, and what do we sacrifice? What does faith look like when it costs something real? These are not questions meant only for the past. They belong to us, because while the plague he faced belongs to another century, fear itself has not changed. Crisis has not changed. Human instinct has not changed. We still live in a world where danger spreads quickly, where panic multiplies faster than truth, where self-preservation often feels wiser than responsibility. And once again, the same questions return. Who will stay? Who will serve? Who will take responsibility when retreat feels safer? The legacy of this Christian is not a set of instructions. It is a mirror. It reflects what faith becomes under pressure. It reveals that belief is not proven in comfort, but in commitment. That courage is not loud or dramatic. It is steady and persistent. He did not change history by seeking recognition. He changed history by refusing to disappear when others needed him most. That is why his story endures, not because it is flawless, not because it fits a heroic narrative, but because it is honest. It shows faith lived at its limits. It reminds us that Christianity, at its core, is not about avoiding suffering, but about meeting it with love, responsibility, and presence. That truth confronts every generation. It challenges us to reconsider what we believe faith is for, whether it exists only to comfort us or to send us into difficult places with courage. The Christian who stayed did not see himself as exceptional. He simply believed that love demanded action, and history agreed. Today, his name may not be widely remembered, but his influence remains wherever faith refuses to retreat, wherever compassion outlasts fear, wherever responsibility is chosen over self-preservation. His story is not finished. It continues every time someone chooses to stay, every time someone enters a place others avoid, every time someone serves with no guarantee of reward, every time someone believes that presence matters more than safety. That is legacy, and that is why stories like this must be told, not to glorify the past, but to prepare the present, because crises will come again. They always do. And when they do, history will not ask what we believed. It will ask what we did. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach more people. Subscribe for more powerful, true stories of Christians whose faith shaped history, and share in the comments which Christian figure from the past you believe we should explore next. Your ideas help shape this channel and ensure these legacies are never forgotten.